Welcome back to another episode of Consciously Clueless. I'm your host, Carly, and I'll be your guide on this journey from consciousness to cluelessness and back around again. Today on the podcast, I am joined by Zipporah Warwood. Zipporah, whose Instagram bio sums it up best, is your local Black vegan who calls out injustices and shares food pics. We got into conversations about those injustices within the vegan movement and so much more. We talked about intuitive eating, eating disorders, spreading veganism with intent, finding your community, and so many more good things. I can't wait for you to hear. Enjoy! So thank you for joining me this morning.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm super excited to chat with you. So the first question I like to ask people, this podcast is called Consciously Clueless. And I chose that name because for me, it meant I was creating this place where I could explore all the things in between being like really conscious and feeling like those moments you're like, I'm on top of it, I'm killing it. And then when you're like, wow, I feel really clueless. I have no idea what I'm doing in this world. And like everything that comes with that. So that being said, I want to just kind of check in with you and see where do you feel like you're falling on that today or right now?
That spectrum. Yeah, I think that's a good way to see things because it's like as much as you will learn different things and like learn new concepts and how things work, there's always so much that there is still to learn. So I think that that's a really good approach of like consciously clueless. Like it's like you're learning, but it's also just like you know that there are so many gaps
Yeah.
still there. But I think that's like the beauty of life, right? As corny as that sounds.
Yeah.
And I think that that's the attitude that we should have because I think that a lot of the times we acquire knowledge and we're like, yeah, like I know what there is to know about this topic, and that's so dangerous because life is constantly changing, people are constantly evolving, and there are always going to be like, you know, different things to learn. So
Yeah, that's such a perfect segue because I think what I really appreciate about starting to follow you on social media and starting to read your blog was that it pushed me in my privilege, in my whiteness, in veganism to realize like, yeah, I don't know all there is to know. And I think that that's a huge thing with being vegan and being white is people are like, yep, cool, nailed it.
yeah, I think it's a very like for a lot of white people, it's the is all end all. Like being vegan is like the whole picture. And I think that that's the danger because I'm like, when I write about like white veganism and like the issues with that, it's not necessarily obviously the fact of being white and being vegan, right? Like that's just like that
Right.
wouldn't make sense. It's the idea that that is the only form of oppression that you feel comfortable denouncing. And that's unfortunately really common for a lot of white folks because they don't do the work to unlearn all these other systems of oppression, right? And it's easy to relate to animals or to want to kind of like save animals because they don't have a voice or they can't advocate for themselves. And so it leaves the room open for people to kind of like barge in and then like make all these rules and create all these groups and like,
Yeah.
you know, Anonymous for the Voiceless, for instance, and really just like be like, there's no excuse to not be vegan and no. And it's like, I get where you're trying to go. Like you want the most amount of people to go vegan. And so
Right.
you're very, you feel strongly about that, but you're not realizing that people have a lot of different lived experiences that complicate the experience of going vegan. And so showing some compassion and understanding to those folks can actually go a long way because you might be actually influencing a lot more people that way. Yeah, I'm not sure what that question was, but yeah.
No. I love it. We're like diving right into the good stuff that I was like thinking about this morning as I was reading your blog, because I definitely think that I've noticed like my Instagram feed has changed in the last few weeks, and I had to do that. Like that didn't happen naturally. That was because folks were like, I hope your Instagram looks different now because of everything that's happening. And it's one of those things that when you have privilege, you don't notice. that's the whole point. Like, that's the beauty of privilege, right? Is I could just like keep on down the path. But having this change and being pushed, and now I can think of a few, I'm not going to live in shame, right? Because that won't move me forward. But I can definitely think of things I've said in the past of just like, why wouldn't you be vegan? Why wouldn't you? Or not even just veganism, something I feel passionate about in the world. Just like, why don't you see how I see it? Like, how can you not get it? And there's so many things that allow me to step into those spaces quite easily and others not to.
Yeah.
And to remember that and to have folks tell you that and check you on that is so important. You've written a couple things on your blog specifically about white veganism and that like savior idea.
Yeah.
And you kind of just talked about that a little bit. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so it kind of stemmed from like a tweet that I had sent. So and it originated from like on social media. There are a lot of like Black people, not necessarily vegan, that were discussing the idea of why people are vegan, or white people in particular. And when you look at, let's say, Black Lives Matter, or like different kind of movements, you'll see that, for instance, like Black people, like we can advocate for ourselves, we can center ourselves within, racial justice. And we're still kind of like marginalized, and we still face a lot of forms of oppression, and white people will still try to center their feelings in it and try to like kind of like bring it back to them, and like, oh, what, I feel this way and this is kind of like about me, when really it's like, no, like Black people are the ones that are like dealing with the brunt of anti-Black racism. And so you just like look at that concept of us being able to vocalize our struggle and whatnot, and then you compare it to animal, like non-human animals, because we're also animals. But you compare that to non-human animals, and you see that they don't have that ability to communicate with us verbally. And so it's quite easy for people who are not used to being checked, and not such as white people, right, to kind of like swoop in and speak on their behalf, which is not necessarily, I would say, malicious in and of itself. But when you look at vegans, right, like if the it's kind of weird to say, but like if like white people or white vegans were really in it because they cared about ending oppression, and it was really about being able to create a more just world for these living beings, it would just make sense for that framework to be applied consistently to other animals as well, so other humans.
Yeah.
And I think that that's my problem, because I wouldn't have to write about white veganism or saviorship within veganism if all vegans were also about denouncing other forms of oppression. And that's not only is that not true, but a lot of vegans will perpetuate and uphold things like ableism, right? And I used to do that as well when I first started. Even though I had an eating disorder and it was really complicated for me to go vegan, once I went vegan, I was like, oh, it's done. Like you don't really have an excuse, or, like, what's your reason, as you said, right? Without realizing like, oh no, like people have completely different lived experiences than me. And just because I've reached this point does not mean that someone else has reached there. And that, yeah, so like the whole like saviorship, or I guess the tweet was like, if animals could speak, many white vegans would not be vegan, specifically because I just can't, like I just think that like if like if an animal were to be like, no, like this is not how I want you to show up, or like you can actually, it's actually okay if someone does like a little bit, at least they're doing something, like don't dissuade someone from trying, like, and a lot of militant vegans, they're like, no, like you can't do any of it. And it's like I don't know that animals would have that same approach, right? And like none of us know. But you can only look at other forms of oppression and see how that's being dealt with, and make your conclusions from there.
Oh wow, that was really beautifully articulated.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's really important because I didn't take into account how white veganism really was
Mm-hmm.
for quite a while. Um, but you're so right. And now being pushed to look at that, I am noticing like some of the organizations that are really outspoken against animal cruelty and being really silent on these other
Mm-hmm.
issues, especially right now.
Yeah, yeah. And that's the thing. It's like I understand that for certain groups, that's not like your cause, quote
Right.
unquote, right? So
Right.
like it makes sense that your feed is not like night and day, like Black Lives Matter
Yeah.
everywhere, because like at the same time there are so few groups that are denouncing animal exploitation. So I understand it, right? But like
Mm-hmm.
you do have an obligation to your fellow human beings to say like, yeah, we're against animal exploitation and we're also with you because we do not stand for any kind of oppression or any kind of and that the extending that compassion, extending that kind of understanding to humans is something that a lot of people will be like, no, it's about the animals, or that's, you know, like they have their movement and we have ours. And it's like, if you think of things in like such categorized way, you're never going to get anywhere, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
you know, people occupy different intersections of being, and so that's just like the least productive way to go about you know, liberation for all people.
Well, and
And
I think that something that when I became vegan, it was for health first. And then I kind of stumbled into like, oh, the
mm-hmm.
environment, oh, animals. But the thing that I think is not talked about as much as those other pieces, like the environment is getting a lot of attention with the intersection of animal agriculture right now, which I think is
Yeah,
beautiful. Um, but like workers' rights, like the people working in these
yeah,
factories.
mm-hmm.
And so, like, the more you dig in, and not in a corny way like we are all one because we experience different things, but it is all connected, like we are
Yeah,
all one because all of those things, like there's a domino effect. They're not
exactly,
these categories that can be like, this is an issue, this is an issue. Like I was just reading about
exactly,
you know, COVID and the people working in those factories that are
mm-hmm.
pig slaughterhouses and everything else. It is all connected. Like all
Yeah,
these forms of oppression are just layered on top of each other.
yep, absolutely. And the thing with like workers' rights in like slaughterhouses or like factory farms, those are often people who are undocumented. They get
Mm-hmm.
paid really low wages. The conditions that they have to work in are atrocious.
Ooh,
Like no bathroom breaks. Like there are things that are just like, why would you like supporting animal agriculture? You're supporting those forms, right? So it's just like, yeah,
yeah, definitely. I think it's hard. It's like one of those things you're like, it would be really easy to pretend that wasn't
mm-hmm.
a part of it too, but it's
Yeah,
also really motivating,
mm-hmm.
you know, to be like, oh, this choice has ripple effects in all these different areas.
Exactly, yeah.
And that is like something for me to cling to, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Because it's like you don't, because once you're, I don't know how long you've been vegan,
Hmm.
but I've been vegan for like 3 years or so. And like you kind of, it just becomes habit. Like you forget about it sometimes.
Yeah.
And it's good to sometimes just be like, oh, you know, like the world is shit and things are terrible. But like at least there's this one thing that I have the ability to do that I'm doing and that I know is like not causing more harm in all of these
Hmm.
different ways. Right. So it's like, that thing that you could cling on to sometimes. Yeah, I feel that.
Yeah, for sure. So tell me a little bit about how you became vegan.
I became vegan. It was like a very long journey. When I was in high school, I watched this video on YouTube called Meet Your Meat.
Oh,
Um, yeah, and so they had
oh,
like a different segment for every animal. So it was like there were like a few minutes where they looked at like chickens and how what they experienced, and then cows and whatever. Well, not whatever, but
yeah.
I remember like oh whatever. I remember seeing that and being so shocked. I was like, I can never do this again. And I was like 14 or something. But I just, you know, lived at home, was not convicted in my
Right.
like I knew it was wrong, and that's like when the seed was planted, but I never like, it's hard to like difficult to say, but I didn't care enough to like
Yeah.
really make the change. But it was always on my radar, so I went vegetarian for a few years. went back to eating meat. Then I went pescatarian. And I also had an eating disorder throughout that process. So it was really hard for me to kind of like, a lot of my comfort foods or like foods that I would binge on were animal based.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I was in like my first year of college or something, I told myself, I was like, okay, veganism is the goal. Like I just like kept researching. I kept like, even when I wasn't vegan, like years before, I was just like watching the videos and the documentaries and just like really trying to ground myself in the why. And
Yes.
it sounds really like violent that I needed to see the videos so often and like really, because when I went about my day, like everyone was just still eating animals. It was still like, so I couldn't be like, it wasn't easy for me to make that connection because it's not like, it was only privy to me when I was watching those documentaries or when I was like watching the videos. Otherwise, like no one was talking about it in my circles, at least. Like I wasn't really following any vegans. So that's one thing that I
Yeah.
started to do was like find people online, and then slowly went from like being pescatarian to like cutting out dairy and then eggs. And then in 2017, like spring of 2017, I just like was like, yeah, like let's go. And yeah, I've been vegan for like 3 years now. So. Mm-hmm.
I really appreciate you talking on your blog openly too about having an eating disorder and like the
Mm-hmm.
intersection of that and becoming vegan. Would you be willing to talk a little bit more about that experience?
Yeah, for sure. So it was just it just complicated the process because because of course like the food part isn't all there is to veganism, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
there's like the clothes aspect, it's like what kind of like makeup that you use, the kind of products that
Right.
like it expands to a lot of things, but the main thing that you kind of like indulge in or partake in fairly regularly is food. And when you look at like the animal exploitation, like the side that's easier to relate is in as much as it relates to the food production, right? So like slaughterhouses and factory farms and whatnot. And so, yeah, it was just difficult because I wasn't able, like, to me, food was just something that was very, it's just like very sensitive. Like I'm not ready to change this because it
Mm-hmm.
caused a lot of anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
And when I did try, it would kind of just trigger a lot of like eating like bad behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
And so it just wasn't healthy for me. So I took it slowly and took it day by day and didn't shame myself for having to do it slowly. And it's a good thing that I wasn't following all these groups that are super like, there's no excuse, like you got to go vegan today, because if I was seeing those messages, I think that it would have dissuaded me a lot. And even though veganism is not about vegans, right? It's about doing the most that you can for the animals.
Right.
I think that like I wasn't I think I would have been one of those people that was turned off and been like, oh, well, like I'm not vegan because like, not these vegans were mean to me. But like, I didn't feel like I could like join into that movement. So yeah, I just followed vegans that like were less militant. So I
Mm-hmm.
could see like examples, and especially like Black vegans, and seeing what they were
Yeah.
cooking and like how they advocated for it. And then when I looked at Black vegans, I was like, oh no, there's like none of this like militant, like restrictive, judgy
Oh,
stuff. Like it was,
interesting.
yeah, and that was key for me. And I don't think I realized it until now, because I was going over the accounts that I was following. I was like, no, like they're like all Black vegans or vegans of color. And I think that was key for me, because I just felt like, okay, like I see representation, one, but also the way in which you're advocating for veganism is like in a way that like I can I feel comfortable taking my time to do this and like respecting my boundaries and being able to be in this in the long haul. So yeah.
Yeah, and you wrote something about spreading veganism with intent, which I think is
Mm-hmm.
what you just started to kind of touch on is, and that is something not just with veganism, but with anything I'm passionate about that I've definitely
Right.
had to learn and I'm still learning,
Mm-hmm.
because I get really excited and I want everyone in my life to follow along. And I'm like, guys, like I'm right.
Yeah.
I swear this
Yeah.
is a good thing to care about.
Yeah.
Um, but telling people what to do doesn't always work.
Exactly. I completely relate. Like having that excitement and just because that's what when I first went vegan, forget about it. Like
Oh,
I was talking to everyone. I was like, "Do you watch a documentary? Like, what are you doing?" Nah, 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 nah. Because it's like it's just a switch, right? Like it's like even though veganism was on my radar for years,
yep.
once you commit to it's like the switch just goes off and you're like, I need everyone to know. And then you have to remember like how you were before that switch was turned on. And then try to influence from that lens. So like I totally get it.
Yeah, it's hard. I also
It's
had it on my radar for years and years. My best friend growing up was vegan for so long. And then once the switch flipped, it was just like you can't unflip it. It's like once it happens, it's hard to describe before to people who haven't experienced it.
Yeah.
And it sounds a little crazy. But once it happens, there's like it's hard to go back, and you see people, especially the health thing, I think was really hard for me to then have people in my life. I was just like, but I want you to live to be 1,000 years old, and I don't want you to eat that anymore, and I'm worried about you. But it doesn't sound like that when you're telling people to like put that burger down.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's like people don't necessarily relate to it because the switch isn't off, right? And you don't know where people are at in their journeys, right? And so like that's something that I talk about a bit in like spreading veganism with intent is like being able to see where someone's at because when I first went vegan, it was very much just like everyone needs to know this is what helped me, and you're just regurgitating everything that you probably compiled for years. You know what I mean? So it's just like, and you don't know where that person is on the, like, let's say for me, it took me, I would say 5 years or so to like come to this. So you don't know where someone is at in that 5 year journey, if that's also something that they're on. So one thing that I've been more privy to is just questions that make sense. So like people who are like, oh, I want to go vegan, but I don't know where to start. That's not someone that like I'm going to necessarily pour in my energy to because that signals to me that you just are looking for someone else to do the work, or you saw veganism and you think that it's trendy and you want to jump on board. Because if you've done a little bit of research, asking, I don't know where to start, it's not something that you would say, especially not in 2020. You would ask things like, oh, I've tried to cut out my dairy consumption, but I'm struggling with cheese, or what's your favorite brand of like milk? Like how do you like, what do you put in your coffee? Like they'll be asking more pointed questions that signal, okay, you've done something. So let me like continue with you, you know? So I think that that's what I meant, like in terms of like making sure that you're cueing into where someone's at in their journey and advising them accordingly, and also knowing when to be like, hey, like it doesn't really seem as though maybe you're like, I would just ask, why do you want to go vegan? When people ask these like really big questions, I'm like, why? And it's usually, oh, well, and you can tell that it's not really founded in anything, which is not anything wrong, right? Like we all start somewhere. But then it's just like, oh, so these are the documentaries that you can watch. Once you watch those, let me know if you want to stick with it, or, you know.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
That's a really good point, is listening to cues of where people are at. I really like that idea of like, okay, I'm going to listen to kind of where you're at and remember my own journey. And I mean, in the beginning, I was as bold as telling people like, well, you just don't get it yet. And now I think of that and I'm like, oh,
I've
no. I'm so sorry. Like, because if someone would have said that to me, like, well, you just don't understand, I would have been so turned off.
Yeah. I think I can remember that too. Yeah. Because it also comes from a place of, it's like that thing that you say before you get in your feels as a vegan, because it's just so heartbreaking when like, you know, and like that, and it's a defense mechanism, right, that we do. And so it comes across as though we're super crass and like, well, you don't get it yet. But then you like turn around and you just feel so defeated. And so like, fuck, I wasn't able to like advocate for animals, or I wasn't able to convince this person. And I think that if we were able to cue into that like sadness or that defeat that we feel, and let people in on that vulnerability, as opposed to being like, oh, well, you don't get it yet, as like an attack, I think people would be better. They'd be like, oh wow, like this person actually really cares about this issue, or like this, and then they could maybe cue in easier, right? Because like we're all, but no one wants to be vulnerable, and that's just like human for us to be like, let me just like hurt you before like I like get into my feels or hurt myself. So yeah.
Well, and it's so like humans are silly, right? Like it's so fascinating how easy it is to forget like exactly what would work for me. And then I was like doing the opposite. Like, you know, like I would connect if someone did exactly what you said, but then that's not what I was doing.
Yeah, exactly. Because you're on the other side, right? And it's like you forget. You're just like, oh, you should also be in this with me. And it's like, no. Like people are completely different. We have our different lived experiences. Like we don't necessarily, we have a really hard job at like putting ourselves in the shoes of other people. And we have to be doing that when we're doing activism, especially, which is funny because like we sometimes don't. And it's like, that's the one moment that you really have to like, yeah.
Yes, absolutely. So you have some amazing pictures of food on your feed and some fun recipes on your blog. That if anyone's looking for inspiration, they should they should head over to you. Did you like cooking and enjoy kind of like that kind of fun food creativity before going vegan, or was that something that happened after?
Yeah, definitely like before. So I was a kid that like grew up watching like TLC and like cooking shows and all these like different like shows that were tailored to obviously adults. So I was doing that when I was like 6 or 7. I like watching, I think it was like Rachel Ray. She has this like segment, this like 30-minute cooking segment. I don't know if
I
you know it, but
remember that. I forgot about that. Yes.
yeah, I would watch that like religiously. Like I'd be like, okay, what is she making? And they kind of just taught me like obviously I also like looking at my parents too and like what they were cooking. But like I'm from Grenada, so my dad's from Grenada and my mom's from St. Vincent, so
Okay.
Caribbean household, and the dishes are usually like I would like pretty complex. So like it was on Sundays, it would do like the whole like cooking for like a week, so you have all these different foods. And when they would cook, it always seemed like this really long endeavor. Like it was just like it just took so much time, and so it was weird for me to watch Rachel Ray like make this food, and like it took like 30 minutes, and I was like, "Are you kidding me? Like it takes me like I'm like my parents take like 3 hours to make food." But it's also like the flavors are a lot more layered, the dishes are more complex, and so like it also comes out in like the results that you have from either, and so. When I was growing up, I was kind of like reconciling both. I'm like, okay, I want to really make like really good food that like my parents make, but I'm also not interested in being in the kitchen for hours. Like that's just not me. And so from a young age, I started cooking in a way that was like multitasking all the time. So it's like I have one thing on the pan, I'm doing dishes here, I'm doing this, and I'm doing everything at once because I'm like, I just want to be out of here. It's weird because I love being in the kitchen, but there's just something
You're not trying
about
to
like
spend the whole night there.
no, absolutely not. And so I think because I started cooking when I was like 7 or 8, like I kind of just like got into the hang of things. So now when I do things, it's kind of just like second nature. And when I was a kid, I would have my parents taste my food. And at first they were just like, this is garbage. Like, what are you doing? And and like but they would give me like small things to make. Like it'd be like, okay, like you can make like stir fry vegetables. I'm like, got it. Like,
Oh, cute.
and then over time I kind of got better at it, and it was kind of a curse because they would just like let me cook for the family, and I was like, oh, that's not what I wanted to do. Like,
wait, no, this isn't what I signed up for. Hold on.
Exactly. So yeah, no, definitely from a young age, it was really fun cooking. So it kind of just translated when I went vegan. But I just had to like relearn a lot of things because a lot of things that I were making were very like animal based. And so, but luckily, like I always cooked with spices and like knowing how different like grains would work with each other and stuff. So yeah, it's been a long time coming.
Have you been able to transition some of the traditional Caribbean food that you grew up making or eating into vegan versions?
For sure, like a lot of the simple ones, yes. There are a lot of dishes that I just luckily, like I have a lot of like family members and like uncles who are also cooks or like good in the kitchen, and so like they'll know how to do a plant-based version of it. Like
Oh, cool.
yeah, because a lot of the dishes in the Caribbean are actually not like I, I mean, like you have like jerk chicken or like you know, curry goat or stuff like that. But they're very easy to kind of like swap because it's really just all about the flavors and the method that you're using. And so you can make like jerk tofu, which is something that I do often. You can make like curried mushrooms, like if you take like really like big yeah um, you could do like the mushroom, and because usually like curry goat will be like goat and potatoes with like some onions
Okay.
and like a curry sauce. And so instead of doing the goat, you would use the mushrooms to kind of like replace it, and then you would do the same method for the potatoes and kind of like make a stew out of that. It doesn't make the same, like you don't have the same chewy texture, but that's definitely like one way that you can kind of like replicate those
Yum.
flavors. I know
That sounds so
so
good.
many
The first thing I thought
possibilities.
of was like jackfruit for that like texture.
Yeah, what do I use jackfruit for in vegan dishes? Like for curry, but more for like roti. I don't know if
Okay.
yeah. So it's like it's a curry that's less, I would say runny than like because
Okay.
curry goat will have like more of a sauce to it, and you tend to eat it with rice. Whereas like the curry that you make for a roti will be like a lot thicker because you don't want it to be. It'll still be saucy, but you don't want it to be like fully running from the roti. So if you did something like that, the meat is tends to be like a little more like pulled, and so like yeah, jackfruit would work really well for that actually. Yeah.
Oh, girl, I'm hungry.
Yeah, me too. I'm like, what can
This
I
sounds
make?
really good. I definitely need to, like, I think just, quarantine, I've been in like a rut of getting the same things from the grocery store. But you said curry, and I was like, yes.
I haven't had a curry in a long time too, so that's like on my radar as well.
For sure. You posted recently on Instagram about intuitive eating, which is
hmm
something I talked to another guest a few weeks ago about, and something I've been thinking about more and more. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
For sure. So intuitive eating is kind of like mindfulness as it's applied to eating. And it has its roots in like Buddhist traditions and like East Asian cultures. And there are two like dietitians, obviously like North American, that kind of ran with that and applied it to eating and the principles. So there are about like 10 principles or so. But the whole, I guess, idea is to be able to cue into your hunger, respect your hunger, kind of go away with diet culture, make peace with food, get over food rules, right? Because there are a lot of things that we think of like, oh, you need to have a plate of like protein, vegetables, and starches, right? Like that's something that's ingrained in all of us. Maybe not all of us, but most of us in like North America.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going away with that and being like, oh no, like if you want to have food, like yesterday, for instance, like I think I had a smoothie in the morning and I had planned to make pancakes. I was like, yeah, I'm going to make pancakes tomorrow. I have the day off. And then I was like, no, like I'm craving a smoothie. So I just made a smoothie. And then I didn't eat until like later. Like I did a spin class. And then I was like, oh, wow, I'm like really hungry, but I just want a bagel. And so I was
Mm-hmm.
like, yeah, you could actually just have a bagel. So I just like toasted a bagel and put some butter on it. Whereas before I would be like, oh no, like I need to get my greens. I need to get my grains in. What about my protein? What about this? And it's like, the thing is, if you're eating intuitively, like over time, your body will kind of like be craving the things that it requires if you're eating, especially like whole foods,
Yes.
because I think that's the part that like I'm not sure if that still abides by food rules, but like if you're practicing intuitive eating, but you're eating like a lot of junk food, I eat junk food, but like not 24/7.
Right.
It makes it hard to cue into your hunger signals because you're eating a lot of empty calories. And so like your hunger just doesn't, you never feel satiated. And so you're not
Mm-hmm.
in a sense able to practice intuitive eating. So I think that one thing that's important is to make sure that you're eating mainly whole foods, so that you're better able to like feel your hunger and kind of like listen to what your body needs.
Yeah, I think it's so important, an important part of mindfulness that is not talked about as much. But something I've been thinking about, again, I usually was really hungry when I woke up in the mornings, and I just haven't been lately. And so like I made some oatmeal, and I was just kind of like twirling it around with my spoon and not really eating it. I was like, why am I have no reason to be forcing myself to eat
Exactly.
this. I'm
Yeah,
not
yeah,
interested. I'm not hungry. I'll save it
Mhm.
for later. And it was like a
Yeah.
novel idea to me. I was like, oh, I
I
don't
know.
have to
Yeah.
eat this breakfast.
It's crazy. Well, because it's like from the time you're a kid, right? It's just like breakfast, lunch, dinner, and like you can't leave the table unless you finish your food, or like, and when you're a baby or when you're growing, like, of course, there's that concern of like you getting your nutrients in, and like
Mm-hmm.
you don't necessarily understand what hunger is, and you're not able to cue in for yourself. And so, yeah, your parents are going to like force feed you to a certain
Right.
extent. But like once you get to a point where you can actually understand what hunger is, you can understand your emotions, you can, like you can articulate different things, and yeah, you can actually practice intuitive eating, whereas like you don't have to eat at certain times, like if you're not hungry. Like I think but again, like with having an eating disorder, that
I
you
was
can run into
wondering.
issues there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's just like you'll convince yourself that you're not hungry a lot of the times. Like
Right.
I've never had really like anorexia, but like with binge eating, you'll kind of go through waves of like, usually it's characterized by just like periods of time where you're just like binge eat. So you eat a lot of food in one
Okay.
sitting, and then you'll kind of like try to restrict yourself and be like, oh, I'm never eating again. And you'll convince yourself of that for like hours, days, maybe, until you're like super hungry, and then you binge again because that's just like how it goes. And so when you're in that period of like convincing yourself that you're never going to eat again, or like calories
Right.
are bad, you like sometimes you are actually starving.
Mm,
But if you tell yourself, oh no, I'm not hungry, or I ate already, then you're confusing what you're actually feeling with like what your disorder is like telling you to, is just telling you not to eat. So
right.
that's something that you have to get over before practicing intuitive eating. And I think that it's a practice and it's a journey. So it's like you're never going to be like fully there, but I think it's about like getting the basis and being able to kind of like work with the different principles.
Well, and I think even the way you described it is better than the limited knowledge I had of it. And it's so easy when these like health and wellness trends pop up
I
to
know.
just start it, but not really
Yeah.
know why, or like the
Yeah.
foundation you should have first. So that's a really good point. Like,
Yeah.
okay, so my issues around food need to be a little more solid, maybe before, like that's
Mm-hmm.
not necessarily a part of the conversation. And that could be really, and it has been damaging to a
Yeah.
lot of people's ideas around food.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's because a lot of people are using intuitive eating as this like new trend.
Mm-hmm.
But if you think of it, as you said, as like mindfulness, it's a part of mindfulness. It's no longer, that's something that you practice day to day. It's something that you constantly like have to check in with yourself and make sure that you're present and that you're there. Whereas like if you look at other like actual trends of like, dieting, or like different, like the keto diet, or like no carbs after this time, or blah blah blah, they usually have the objective is for you to lose weight,
Right.
for the most part. And intuitive eating is not about losing weight, it's about being able to feed yourself in a way that like honors your body and helps it thrive. And so for some people that means that you will gain weight, right? Some people it means that you will lose. Some people will stay stagnant. But it's not about that, right? It's about like
Mm-hmm.
cueing into what your body actually needs. And I think that like that's why I really try to not like promote it or like talk about it in a trendy way, because it's so complicated. And I think it's just like a way of seeing food and a way of like going about life, kind of like a little like veganism, in a sense that it's like there's not a specific kind of vegan that you have to be.
Right.
Like you be health vegan, you could do this, you could do that. There are a lot of different ways that you can be vegan.
Right.
But at the end of the day, it's about like not exploiting animals. And same thing with intuitive eating. It's like at the end of the day, it's just about honoring your body and eating to satisfaction.
That's the piece I want to like key in on, that when you
Mm-hmm.
said honoring the body,
Mm-hmm.
because we have so removed food from this idea of nourishment.
Yeah.
In, I think, a really damaging way. And when I was training to become certified as a health and wellness coach, that was the thing I kept coming back to, is how many diets that pop up are so unsustainable. I felt like I had this secret. I was like, oh, people can just eat whole
Mm-hmm.
food, plant-based,
Yeah.
and like not count things. And of course there's goals if you have health goals or health issues. Like, I'm not saying that. And
For sure.
but really the sustainable long-term like healthy thing, as I was going through this training, I was like, it's literally just eating plants. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's how we
Yeah.
honor the body.
Yeah. Well, because like, especially like unrefined or like, like whole foods, right? Like plants, as you said, like they allow you to feel full, like the way that they like fill your stomach.
Mm-hmm.
And the I don't know, there's so many properties, and I'm embarrassed because I did like a whole certificate in nutrition, but like there are certain properties of food that are like exist in like plants that allow the fiber, especially, right? Like it allows
Yeah.
your stomach to actually feel full, as opposed to if you're just drinking, I don't know, just eating donuts. That's just fat. It's just oil. And it's fine to eat donuts. Like I eat a lot of donuts, but like if you're only eating that, like your body is not able to, it doesn't fill up to the point that it needs to be like, oh yeah, wow, I'm satiated, because oil just doesn't occupy that same space in your stomach. And when you break it down in that way, I think that like it's easy to be like, oh yeah, like you just got to eat more plants, and that should be the focus. But it's hard because like that's just like not the food that gets promoted, and it's not the way that we're taught to think about food. We're just
Yeah.
yeah.
That's what I was thinking too, is a part of intuitive eating. Not only when are you hungry, but when are you full?
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
another thing too that I think is really interesting. And I mean, I've done it recently, I'm sure, with like a bowl of popcorn the size of my head. Like, all of a
Yeah.
sudden you're done and you're like, oh, I was full like 20 minutes ago.
Absolutely. And I talk about this a lot like in the blog post that's on my Patreon. But it's like knowing when I'm hungry, I'm like, okay, I got that piece. But the
Yes.
full part, because it, I don't know, because it's like it's comforting, it's like something you do when you're bored. It kind of, and those lines get blurred a lot. And I think it's fine to sometimes seek out food for comfort. I think it's fine
Mm-hmm.
sometimes to seek out food for, you know, but it becomes dangerous when you're doing it all the time, because you're no longer able to cue into your fullness signals, right? So yeah, everything in moderation, as they say. Yeah.
Oh, that's so true. I really appreciate you talking a little bit more about that, because I think it's an important conversation to have alongside talks about like veganism and food and
Yeah.
that kind of thing. Because if veganism has done anything for me, it's increased my mindfulness in like every area of life.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it definitely like set me on the path of thinking more critically about stuff in general.
Nice.
And I think intuitive eating is a part of that.
Nice. How long have you been vegan?
Officially, like 2 years.
Nice.
But I definitely related to your story of the like years
Yeah.
of getting there, because as I mentioned
Yeah.
before, she's going to get mentioned a lot on this podcast. My best friend growing up, she was vegan from a really young age. She was vegetarian, then she was vegan, then she was vegetarian and vegan, and way ahead of the curve.
Right.
You know, like in middle school, talking about
Wow.
veganism. And I'm in northern Minnesota, so it's
Yeah.
not like it was like a big conversation anywhere. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that's the thing I always fall back on when I think of how I can influence others is how I grew up hunting and fishing and, eating an
Oh,
American
wow.
standard Western diet. And she
Yeah.
just was my best friend and stuck
Oh,
by me and planted seeds, but like didn't push me.
yeah.
And when I think of that, I'm like, how can I talk harshly to anybody about making
Mhm.
an immediate change
Yeah.
when it took me years to understand and for those things to really come to fruition? So I cut out red meat, and then I was pescatarian. And so I like very much related to your
Very
journey. And I
similar.
found out I
Yeah.
was lactose intolerant
Oh.
years prior. So that
Hmm.
made me cut out dairy. And then I was taking those pills that help you digest dairy.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, I
And then
know.
it like hit me. I all of a sudden one day hit me and got really grossed out. I was like, oh, I'm taking something to digest the milk of another animal.
Yeah.
Like
And
all of a
that's
sudden it
so
hit
weird.
me and I like threw them
Yeah.
in the garbage. I was like, ew.
Yeah. Yeah. It's crazy that like the lengths that we go to in order to like consume another animal's. I'm just like, what? Like most of us are lactose intolerant, but I think it's really
Yes.
beautiful that your like best friend was able to, because that's like an incredible. It's probably because she went vegan when she was so young, so it's like compassion just comes a lot easier to you when you're
Yes.
younger. But that like just being able to continue being friends with you and like just like and understand that like that's a tremendous amount of like compassion and understanding that like we all as vegans need to be able to extend to other people. So I think that's really incredible.
Yeah, I agree. Once I was officially vegan, her mom was like, "Do you think it was because of Michelle that this
Yeah.
happened?" And I was like, I mean, it definitely started with her when we were 8
Yeah.
years old. Like that, I
Hmm.
was just slow to grow that one.
Yeah. For sure. Like, yeah, sometimes I just kind of want to speed up the growth for some people. Like, I'm just like, what can I do to get that journey quicker? Um,
Yes.
but I think that in some instances, maybe we can, especially now in 2020, because it's like, there's so many more resources available now than there
Hmm.
were, let's say, like 5 or 10 years ago. And so, like, I think that or at least for me, like, I just try to kind of like introduce people to different dishes and kind of have them, like, even if they're not ready to go vegan, I'm like, I don't care. You don't got to be vegan. Like, you can make this dish, you can make this one. Um,
Yes.
look, and just like show them different things. And so like that just like influx of like information and kind of like things that you can make and like here's this food that I made without necessarily even talking about veganism sometimes because like people have that knee jerk reaction when you like mention animal rights or veganism or
Yes,
cruelty or all that
for
stuff.
sure.
So I just like remove that from my vocabulary and I'm like, hey, like there's this really like cool dish that I make, or like there's this like event going on, or just like talking about things without necessarily using those words that like trigger people. And I'm just like, let's go. But in the back of my
Yes.
mind, I'm just like, this is,
Like
I feel,
waiting for the moment.
yeah, yeah, I feel like a Jehovah Witness sometimes. It's like, just like, have you heard about our Lord and Savior? Yeah.
I love making dishes and having that moment where someone's like, "Oh, this is vegan." And like my face is just like,
Yeah. Yeah.
"Yes, it is."
Yes.
And
Yes.
you were surprised. You liked it.
Yeah.
Like I can't like
Yeah.
smile any bigger when someone's like, "Oh, this is
Yeah.
good." I'm like, "I
Hmm.
gotcha."
Exactly. Yeah. I think, but there's so many options. Like I remember the first time that I had my dad try like an A&W. So like in Canada, there's this like restaurant chain called A&W, and they were one of the first to bring out the plant-based like the Beyond Meat burger.
Mm.
And so this happened, I think, like a year after I went vegan, so like in 2018. They like brought that out, and I was ordering it like every other week. Like it was ridiculous, and and my dad was like, "Oh, just like order me a regular burger," and I was like, "Oh, sure." And I ordered him like the Beyond Meat burger,
Hmm.
and he couldn't. He was like, he ate it and he finished it. He was like, "Wow, that was
Yes.
really good," and I was like, I think he said like it's less burnt than usual or it's less crispy. And I was like, yeah. And I told him, I was like, oh, well, that was actually like the vegan. And he was like, no. And he like went in the garbage, like took out the like wrapper. He was like, are you serious? And I was like, yeah, like this is what you're missing out on just because of your notions of what vegan food is. And
Mm,
like after that, like we got to try a lot of different like restaurants and stuff because he was like, oh, I want to try all of the things if this is what's possible, you know? So
yeah.
yeah.
Has anybody in your friends or family kind of immediate circle become more plant-based because of your influence?
Yeah, so my dad actually went plant-based, more for health reasons,
Okay.
because he was diagnosed with like cancer, and unfortunately like, he passed in 2018. But like he
Oh, I'm sorry.
definitely, no, it's okay. But he like got on that wave, and like it was
Yeah.
crazy because he outlived a lot of his like the expectations that
Oh,
were like
wow.
placed upon him. Yeah, because he was out here doing all the things, like he was super active and had like stage 3 cancer and was like pretty ill at times.
Damn.
Yeah, and he was just like doing, and you couldn't tell. And I think a lot of it was because of like the foods that he was eating. He was like also like super healthy. Like he was like, I would be eating like Oreos and stuff, and he was like, oh, I don't eat that junk food, and he'd be like making himself like callaloo and like kale and all these like good stuff. And he got like he would cook a lot for his friends as well. So
Okay.
yeah, he definitely like went plant based, which was cool. My sister was like on and off vegetarian. And mainly my friends though, like I would say that like I think all of my friends are vegan. Wow, that's actually crazy. I'm trying to think now. Yeah, I don't have any like close friends that are not vegetarian at the least. Like I think I have like 2 vegetarian friends, and for the most part, my circle is vegan. Like it took
That's
a long time
amazing.
though. Yeah, it's really cool. It's like I love it. Like it's and for some people, like it happened without me necessarily having to like push the agenda. Like one of my friends, we had went for brunch in I think it was like the weekend after Mother's Day. And she was someone who's like very pro like an activist in all the ways. And so I knew that veganism would relate to her because it's just like an extension of that. But I
Yep.
didn't, she's also Black. And so it's really hard in the Black community, especially to like go vegan because of the preconceived notions of what it is.
Mm.
And then we just like went for brunch, and she was like, yeah, like I didn't tell you, but I've like been vegan. And I literally started crying. I'm so dramatic. Like I was like, I was like, when did this happen? Oh yeah, it was a month after Mother's Day. Yeah. And she's like, oh, like Mother's Day. And I'm like, you've been vegan for a month and you haven't told me. Like I was, but anyway, I was just like a mess. But yeah, like she's been vegan for like a year, 2 years, and has like influence on like her family members, and she's
Mm.
just like, and now we just get to talk about it, and it's like, and the switch has gone off for her, so we have these conversations like the one I'm having with you, and it's just like it's so great to be able to connect with like
Yeah.
people in that way that you like care about so deeply, and it just like I feel deepens your bond with those people because it's just like, yeah, I understand you so much. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like one of those people you can catch their eye out in a crowd when something happens and you're like, you're seeing this, I'm seeing this. Like that's the type of
Yeah,
bond.
exactly. Exactly. You're like, yo, we in this. Like,
Mm-hmm. For
yeah, it just like
sure.
gives another layer to your friendship. It's so beautiful. Yeah.
That's lovely. Well, I really appreciate chatting with you this morning.
Of course.
Couple last questions. What do you do to slow down and become present or conscious and just kind of like check in with yourself? And has that evolved over time?
I do a really bad job at that. I've started like journaling more regularly.
Mm,
So whenever like I remember to, I'll like jot something down, and not necessarily because I have something to write, just because I think that practice is like really healing without necessarily realizing it.
yes, agreed.
So just like picking up a pen and just like writing it down. And then another thing that I've been doing is like having like a nighttime routine, which is like my skincare routine. So I have that as well as like my daytime routine. And I used to just kind of, just wash my face and like go about my day. But now I just like take the time and kind of like moisturize myself and really just like cue into to me and like notice the changes even in my face and like really just like sit with that, because I think that a lot of the times we just like look in the mirror to see like our flaws and stuff, as opposed to just like being like, oh wow, like this has changed, or I see how this is, you know. And it's kind of like you're noticing things about yourself as though like as you would when you're like caring for a child, you know what I mean? You're just like, oh wow, they're growing up so fast, and it's like you don't realize that you're also changing like day to day. So that's also something that I've like started noticing, and like just taking more time to be present in like the everyday things that I do.
That's beautiful. That's a form of mindfulness for sure.
I guess, yeah.
You know,
Yeah,
paying attention and being like recognizing your own glow up day to day.
Yeah.
Like, oh, okay, yeah, look at what's happening in my body. Like, that's a good check-in. Have I not asked you anything that you want people to know, or anything that you want to share that you haven't been given space to?
No, not particularly. I'm just curious as to what like the title for this would be.
I'm not sure yet.
Because I feel like we've covered a lot of stuff. So
but I'll keep you posted.
Right? I mean, it goes with like Consciously Clueless, right? It's just like a lot of different things that you learn about. So no, thank you so much for having me. This was like really amazing.
Yeah, this is so fun. I love, like, selfishly in the beginning too, I was just like, if nobody listens, it doesn't matter, because I've started connecting with all these amazing people.
Yeah.
And learning so much that like is enough. So where can people connect with you? Because I know they're going to want to after this.
Yes. So my Instagram is Zipporah the Vegan. I post pretty much daily. My blog is zipporahthevegan.com. I don't post too much there anymore, but I do post a lot on Patreon. So again, Zipporah the Vegan. I have like different tiers depending on like people's, I guess, like commitment or willingness to donate. And yeah, like I write a lot about, like, I have a blog post about intuitive eating. I do like vegan life hacks. So different like tips and tricks for people who are like going vegan, or even people who are vegan who are like trying to switch things up. Not that I'm a guru or anything, but I feel like after 3 years, like I gotta give a tip here and there.
Absolutely.
So yeah, so Instagram is Zipporah the Vegan, blog is zipporahthevegan.com, and Patreon is also Zipporah the Vegan.
Awesome. I'll put everything in the show notes so people can get a hold of you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Carly. This was amazing.
Yeah, thank you so much. I look forward to connecting with you more and more in the future. Thanks for listening to another episode of Consciously Clueless. I hope you grew as much from that episode as I did. I'm so excited to keep connecting with Zipporah. She is a wealth of knowledge. If you are enjoying listening to this podcast, subscribe wherever you're listening. If you could go to Apple Podcasts and leave a review, that would help out so much to get this podcast into the ears of other listeners. And you might just be read as the review of the week on one of my weekly solo episodes. Thanks so much for your continued support, and I will see you in the next episode.